Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to this special 5-part podcast series sponsored by Affiliated Monitors, which celebrates Affiliated Monitors' 15 years in business as the first entity specializing in independent integrity monitoring. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides independent integrity monitoring and ethics and compliance assessments nationally and internationally and across almost all industries. With its knowledge of effective ethics and compliance programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitors is respected for its work as the corporate monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even individuals. Having served in nearly 750 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help improve your company's ethics and compliance programs, visit this podcast series sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, at www.affiliatedmonitors.com. In this 5-part series, I visit with Jesse Kaplan, the Managing Director of Corporate Oversight at Affiliated Monitors, in a series on emerging issues in healthcare compliance and independent monitoring. We take up the opioid crisis, focusing on prescribing opioids, regulatory and compliance risks, the identifying and mitigating risks around opioid prescribing. We consider the expanded use of an independent monitor in healthcare regulatory situations. Then we take a look at it from the independent integrity monitoring of healthcare organizations and systems. And finally, we conclude with using independent integrity assessments and monitoring to limit adverse consequences of compliance violations. This 5-part series is sponsored by Affiliated Monitors, and it is a special presentation of the Compliance Podcast Network. In episode 1, we discuss the many different types of potential regulatory and liability risks healthcare provider organizations and practices face in connection with the prescribing of opioids. In this episode, Jesse Kaplan discusses how healthcare organizations can identify and mitigate the risks from opioid prescribing by their practitioners. Hello, everyone. Tom Fox, back for another episode with Jesse Kaplan, Managing Director at Affiliated Monitors. In this episode, we're going to focus on opioid prescribing, identifying and mitigating the risk. Jesse, first of all, welcome back.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. My pleasure.
Jesse, in our past episode, we discussed many of the different types of potential regulatory or liability risks healthcare providers and organizations face in connection with the prescribing of opioids. Today, I wanted to visit about how healthcare organizations can identify and mitigate those risks. So let me just start with really what can healthcare organizations do, particularly their compliance functions, to identify and then move to mitigate or remediate the risks from opioid prescribing?
Yeah, so healthcare organizations, can do a number of things, and those organizations and medical practices can be proactive, in particular, in making sure they have an opioid compliance program or plan, that program incorporates all the relevant federal and state laws and regulations. It incorporates CDC prescribing guidelines and relevant standards of practice, and that prescribers have been educated on the opioid prescribing program. And finally, that the organization is assessing actual prescribing practices by their physicians in order to flag potentially risky practices. So I can give you some examples of what an effective opioid prescribing program might look like. An effective opioid prescribing program should incorporate policies and procedures that inform prescribers what they need to do before they prescribe opioids and what needs to be documented, which is very important. For example, what needs to be asked as part of a medical history of the patient? Has the physician checked the state's prescription drug monitoring program database, which is something we talked about in the last episode? For that patient's prescribing history. Has the physician counseled the patient on alternatives as well as the risks of using opioids? Does the patient have a pain contract, which is something we can talk about a little bit later, a little bit more about? And is all this documented in the medical record? The program should inform on the limitations on prescribing within that state, quantity and dosages, and what combinations of drugs are counterindicated. The program should address what follow-up the physician should engage in with the patient after prescribing opioids. Like what needs to be done before a physician renews an opioid prescription. And, for example, should blood or urine screening be required of the patient? The organization should also make sure that prescribers are being adequately educated on all appropriate prescribing policies, procedures, laws, and regulations. And frankly, that the doctor is taking the required or the appropriate continuing medical education courses. If they've got a patient panel that includes a lot of people on chronic pain and on chronic opioids, they should be taking continuing medical education on opioid prescribing and pain management. And I guess I'd say, is the physician prescribing being audited or monitored to identify potentially risky practice? They should have someone looking at a sampling of charts to see whether or not the physician is following the policies and the standards of practice when they do prescribe chronic opioid treatments.
Almost every physician I've ever been associated with certainly had the patient's best interest in mind, and they want to help those with chronic pain, and they want to help those who are injured either recover from those injuries and certainly get better. But I was wondering, even within the context of those types of physicians who we both admire and hopefully see to us when we need, can you give us some examples of deficient opioid prescribing practices that you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. And just a little intro on that. So our firm, Affiliated Monitors, we work with physicians with expertise in opioid prescribing and pain management. And working with those physicians, we have assessed the prescribing practices of many physicians who are, like you said, legitimately trying to address the needs of their patients. But in many cases, the physicians are just not following the evolving best practices and the new and evolving regulations and guidelines. So, and when they don't, not only are they putting their patients at risk of harm, but as we discussed in the last episode, they could put themselves and their organization at risk of legal jeopardy. So, getting into your question, some of the most common deficiencies we see in opioid prescribing include where physicians are not conducting sufficient examinations to truly determine the cause of the patient's pain that would warrant treatment with opioids. Instead of perhaps a non-medication treatment or other medications or physical therapy, for instance. We see physicians prescribing opioids for conditions where opioid treatment is just not the appropriate first-line treatment or may not be an indicated treatment at all. Where physicians are not documenting sufficient medical, social, or family histories or considering those factors that could raise red flags for potential addiction. Where physicians are not checking the state's prescription drug monitoring program database to see whether the patient is being prescribed controlled substances by maybe another physician. As I mentioned earlier, this is very important to see whether the patient may be doctor shopping or abusing medications, or even taking combinations of medications that may be dangerous. We look to see, and we've seen situations where prescribing opioids, where physicians are prescribing opioids in dosages or numbers of pills that are inconsistent with guidelines or state laws and regulations. We've seen situations where doctors are not closely following patients on chronic opioid treatment programs or reevaluating their pain diagnosis and whether or not the pain medication is actually working. Many patients on chronic opioid treatment programs should be subject to toxicology screens. And what those do is they'll tell a physician what is showing up in their blood or urine and whether or not, number one, they're taking the drugs that the physician has prescribed and or whether they're taking other drugs. If the tox screen, for instance, is negative, let's say, for the drugs that the physician has prescribed, well, that's a red flag that the patient may actually be diverting the opioids, means, selling it or giving it to someone else. If the tox screen shows that the patient is taking drugs that the physician has not prescribed, particularly controlled substances, well, that may be indication that this patient has a drug abuse problem. Patients on chronic opioid treatment should also be followed by what's called a pain contract, which is an agreement that the patient signs with the physician that explains the risks of opioid treatment and that sets out the ground rules for what the patient is and is not permitted to do with the medications being prescribed. So this agreement will not only provide valuable information for the patient, as you can imagine, but it also gives the physician a basis for discontinuing opioid treatment if the patient violates the agreement. And I guess finally, one thing we see is that doctors are not prescribing naloxone where they should. Now, naloxone is a medication that is very effective at reversing the dangerous effects of an opioid overdose. It can basically save their lives. And the CDC recommends that naloxone be considered for patients receiving 50 or greater medical morphine equivalents, or MME, of opioid medication. So the evolving standard practice is doctors should be prescribing naloxone for many of their patients receiving opioid prescriptions. They're just not doing that.
Jesse, one of the things that I've heard you and other managing directors at affiliated monitors talk about is the power of proactive monitoring or proactive approach to many different areas. And it sounds like to me that one of the things that healthcare organizations can certainly benefit from is a proactive approach, indeed in the opioid prescribing area and issues around that. I was wondering if you had some thoughts as to how proactive monitoring can help a healthcare organization and how they would go about doing that.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we certainly feel that can really help an organization. That's based on our experience working with healthcare organizations as well. So, like you said, a healthcare organization can take a proactive approach by having an experienced and expert clinician in pain management and opioid prescribing assess the organization's opioid compliance program and policies, but also review samplings of patient charts of their physicians where patients have been prescribed opioids. Such an assessment can help identify gaps in the program. It can flag physicians who may be engaging in risky prescribing practices. And most important, what these assessments can do is it gives an expert in the area the opportunity to offer recommendations to the organization for improving the opioid prescribing program and their physician prescribing practices. This information can be used, very effectively to mitigate risk to the organization, the physicians, and the physician's patients.
So, Jesse, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for episode 2, but I hope you'll join us again tomorrow, where I continue my exploration with Jesse Kaplan on the expanded use of independent monitoring by healthcare agencies. Jesse, as always, thank you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Tom.
This is Tom Fox. I hope you enjoyed this episode in our 5-part exploration of emerging issues in healthcare compliance and independent monitoring. Also, I hope you will check out our sponsor's website, www.affiliatedmonitors.com. I hope you will join us again for another episode. This 5-part podcast series on emerging issues in healthcare compliance and independent monitoring is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.